guy Ross Jackson, LouisianaSports.net. You know him, you love him, covering the Saints out there. Ross, what's going on, brother? How we doing?
Hey, man, I'm doing great. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me this morning.
All right, so what's maybe been your biggest takeaway? Obviously, the Saints, they leave Metairie. They go out west. They have a preseason game against the Chargers, going to practice against the Rams. What's kind of been the biggest takeaway maybe in the road trip?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I would highlight, sticking with the biggest story, which is that quarterback battle, is that the quarterback battle got a lot more tight out here, got a lot more competitive out here. That felt very much that quarterback battle like that was, kind of Spencer Rattlers from the very beginning out in Metairie, out in New Orleans, kind of getting, accustomed to, or being the guy that's already kind of accustomed to the NFL game and the NFL speed and all those other things. That kind of worked to his advantage early on during training camp. But then the Saints got out here to California and they did a lot more of these kind of call it practice periods. So they went away from kind of the scripted, we're working this situation and this down and distance with this play, with this goal in mind. And it just got into some live play calling, almost like simulations, scrimmages in some cases as well. And that really kind of elevated Tyler Shough's game a bit, I think. And we've seen him really build momentum here over the course of these West Coast training camps. So now the Saints will go back to do this preseason game on Sunday against the Jacksonville Jaguars and still have a very, very tight quarterback battle. And so I think that would be my biggest takeaway, is just went from Spencer Rattler kind of leading the way to at least it still being now tight enough for this battle to continue going into that second preseason game.
Yeah, Ross, and I agree with you. It almost felt like they were going to make a call, the last couple of days, maybe even after the first preseason game. And then Shough comes in, has some nice moments, certainly nice 2-minute drive. And now it seems like they're, still in full-on position battle mode. So, when do you think, because, like you said, second preseason game, we know there's only 3 games now. When do you think a call is actually going to be made?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that you're going to see with this is that you might see 2 different calls, right? You might see one that happens privately, and then you have the announcement that happens after the case. And so a public announcement will probably be different than the actual decision itself. But I think the Saints are in a position now to where they could be just one really strong performance away from either announcing or making up their mind or kind of having that decision made for them. I think that if you look at where the Saints can be following that Jacksonville Jaguars game on Sunday, that could be the big, kind of situation there that effectively tells them, hey, this is going to be the guy that we're going to go with. The Saints have seen this before. They had a preseason game against the Jacksonville Jaguars years ago when they were trying to make their decision between Jameis Winston and Taysom Hill, if you remember that a couple of years ago. And it was a big performance by Jameis Winston that ended up sealing that conversation. And so if either one of these guys comes in and has a considerably more impressive performance or a considerably more consistent and impactful performance up against Jacksonville, that could be the proverbial nail in the coffin, as it were. But I think you would have to do something that's going to convince this team to hand it over at that point. Otherwise, I could see this going into game week. I could see this going into, at least this week. The tricky part is, and you guys know this well, that after the second preseason game with the preseason now being condensed, this is kind of, after this game, you start to move into some week one preparation. You kind of know what your roster is going to be after this game, with some exceptions. Those guys that are still battling for spots and vying for opportunities, they're going to play in that third preseason game, but you're probably not going to play a ton of guys that you're sure about in that third preseason game. And so you can start to transition your, first team focus and your early team focus over to game planning, and having a quarterback ready for that could be really valuable. So I would say that if one of those guys comes out and has some kind of emphatic enough performance and there's a separation in the game against Jacksonville, that the Saints could feel pretty comfortable at least starting to change their focus before making the announcement about who that starting quarterback might be.
Do y'all have any indication or heard from any of the coaches on how they're going to do the rotation for the Jacksonville game? Because there's a big difference between playing in the first half of a preseason game versus the second half. It's hard. You can't judge those apples to apples. So do y'all have any indication how that's going to be? It would be better to have a true series by series if you're trying to really compare apples to apples as closely as possible. But you've seen it. deep balls present themselves in practice. A guy makes a good move. It might not present himself for the other guy. And so that day, like that guy that hit the deep ball because a guy got open looks better than the other guy because the guy didn't have a guy like streak open.
Right.
Like things are skewed. That's why it's so hard to like make a final call with two unknowns and to make such a big decision on the most important, because you have to figure out the best way to compare apples to apples as close as possible. And every day in practice or every game situation is not created equal. So what's the indication right now on how they're going to do it?
Yeah, they haven't made any kind of indication to us just yet. I think that the typical rhythm would be to let Tyler Shough get sort of that first crack at the first team. You had Spencer Rattler do that in the first game. You could give Tyler Shough that opportunity here in the second game. But as in terms of how that rotation actually looks, right, is that one quarter, is that, like you said, drive by drive, which I think would be wise. Is it, 5 drives here, 5 drives there, like we kind of saw during that preseason game, during the first preseason game? We haven't really got an indication of that just yet. And to your point, I completely agree with sort of the preseason evaluation, if you will, because the other thing is you're going out there and you're a starter in the preseason and you're taking quote unquote first team reps, but you're taking quote unquote first team reps with maybe your first team offensive line, but not with your first team skill players, for instance. Sure. And so do you really have your starting lineup, right? And so I think that's one of the reasons why yesterday's joint practice was so important for the Saints and in evaluating that quarterback competition, because that was really the only time that we've seen over and over and over again Tyler Shough and Spencer Rattler both kind of go drive for drive with the actual first team players that they, are going to line up next to in week 1 in 2025. Right. And so yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why maybe New Orleans really wanted that kind of late scheduled joint practice and tried to pull that off and did pull that off as they did, because it kind of gives them that additional evaluation.
Yeah, Ross, one of the things that was surprising in the opening preseason game was the struggles of the interior offensive line. Certainly Cesar Ruiz, a player that is going to, obviously be counted on. How have the practices gone against the Rams? Because the Rams have one of the better young defensive fronts in all of that, the National Football League.
Yeah, not great. The Rams, not great. The Rams' defensive line kind of took them to task. I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, it was, and look, there's a couple of things, there's a couple of pieces of kind of context around that. You don't game plan for joint practices, right? You don't watch tape for joint practices. You don't do those kinds of things, especially in a situation like this where they were kind of thrown together in a rush. And they were kind of, impressively thrown together in a rush, by the way. Like, just the logistics of getting that together in less than a week is pretty astronomical. And so, but, as a team, you're not watching game tape to get ready for, and you're not game planning for these joint practices. You're running scripted plays. You're doing all these things. And so I give a little bit of that context just to say that, like, a lot of the stuff that the Saints struggled with were stunts, twist, things like that you would identify on tape and learn how to counter and have a plan for, that you just kind of walk into a joint practice with no plan for. So you just kind of have to respond to what it is that you see. Like, you have a general idea of what these guys like to do. Like, Chris Shough is evolving that defense going into another year as a defensive coordinator there after Raheem Morris left and everything. And so there are things that they're going to be doing differently. And so, would I say that there was something you should look at from an optimistic standpoint when it comes to that offensive line going up against the Rams' really talented defensive line? No, not necessarily. But if there's a silver line coming out of it, it was like, hey, that's what it looks like without game planning. Week 9, when they go up against the Rams, they'll have a chance to game plan a little bit, go over some game film, and then see how they can improve there. And so I would look for the offensive line to perform better week 1 than we saw them perform in the joint practices. But yeah, no, they got taken to task quite a bit during those joint practices.
Tell us, like, the one position group or unit that during this joint practice where you sat there and watched and consistently you could say, all right, not bad. That looks pretty good. Like, pretty excited about that. What was that moment?
Yeah, I mean, that's the edge rushers for me, the Saints edge rushers. Chase Young had a phenomenal day. The dude had, like, multiple pressures, 2 sacks that I would have felt pretty comfortable calling sacks. I mean, it's Jimmy Garoppolo. You're not really escaping much, right, in those situations. And so, you're getting back there, you're getting into the – yeah, well, I mean, that just means he's not the most mobile guy, you know what I mean? And so, you're getting back there, he's getting these pressures and everything like that. He's getting a couple of sacks, I would say. during the day too. But then he also had like 3 pass breakups because 2 of them he just got into the backfield and was able to knock down these sort of swing or outlet passes out to the flat to the running back. And he was actually in coverage against, I believe it was, might have been Tyler Higbee. It was one of the tight ends where he literally broke up a pass in coverage and everything. Because these edge rushers, like this 3-4 scheme, you're going to have to drop every now and then. Yeah. And so, he did that and ended up getting a play. So I thought he had just a fantastic day. One of the better days that I've seen from Shough. And look, you're hoping that this team, if you're this team, you're hoping that they're going to be able to unlock this guy's potential in a way that other teams haven't been able to before. And Brandon Staley just seems like maybe the right guy to get that done. So we'll see what that looks like in the regular season. I thought that Carl Granderson had a strong day from that position group. Fidel Diggs had a potential sack. We saw Chris Rumpf with a potential sack as well. And so it just feels like that edge rusher position has gone from, 3 marquee name guys in Shough, Carl Granderson, and Cam Jordan to maybe having up to 6, 5 or 6 players that can be contributors, and I think that's a good place to be at that position group.
Ross, one of the things we talked about last week, it was so difficult to evaluate the running backs because of how poor I thought the offensive line played. And even a play, that was a 2-yard run, it's like, man, I can see some burst from the running backs and Kendre Miller. It's like, I get it. I get why he's getting 3rd and 4th chances because you see that burst that he has, but it's so tough to evaluate them because it's like, where do you tell them to go? Like I was watching the end zone copy of the game and me and Matt kind of had the same thought process. It's like, I don't know where to tell him to go on this run. That's why it's a 2-yard run, because they just never were able to really get going. Like that was a surprise to me just because this offensive line that you've had, so many big investments in, like if it's pass protection, okay, maybe not as shocking, but in the run game, like it was very tough to evaluate these running backs. And I think that's one of the more intriguing position battles, I think, in camp.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think you're right. Like, so to match an analytic with your tape, the Saints offensive line allowed just 0.55, so half a yard before contact on each of those rushing attempts in Sunday's game. And so the reason why that metric is important is because that's effectively, for those that aren't familiar with it, an offensive line metric that shows how much room are you giving your running back before he's touched by a defender. And so you typically want to be around 1.5 to 2.5 yards. Somewhere in that range is a range from successful to very successful. And you kind of want to be in that range when it comes to that. And the Saints were about 1/3 to 1/5 of that in terms of their per carry production during this game. Now, I think that is a big piece of context that matches what you guys are talking about in terms of like, I don't know where to tell Kendre Miller to go with this football. And he had 20 yards after contact. However, he only had 14 rushing yards, which shows you how often he was being contacted behind the line of scrimmage, right? And so I think that those are the little things that you really need to see and want to see accelerate in terms of the conversation. And to be clear, too, we're talking about the Kendre Miller rushes, which happened a lot behind starting offensive line guys. These aren't, runs behind the 3rd team offensive line or anything like that. Like this was behind the starting offensive line, or sans Eric McCoy, of course, who didn't play in the game, but starting offensive line, and then minus 2 or 3 guys, at certain times. And so you want to see when you get that full complement of starting offensive linemen on the field, even though Trevor Penning's probably not going to be one of those guys early on. It might be Dylan Radins at left guard. We'll see where things go with his injury, but that's a place where you need to see this team improve, and where they struggled in each of the last few years. And look, Kellen Moore's got a great run scheme, but part of having a great run scheme is being able to execute on the offensive line to create what you need to create for those running backs, not force the running backs to create on their own. And so that's going to be a really, really important sort of piece of progress to track over the course of the preseason. And I would say early on, like the first month, as offensive line play around the NFL settles in with the regular season.
Ross, before they headed out to California, we had kind of heard the rumblings and people saying that Rasheed Shaheed might have been the MVP of camp up to that point. Did that carry over to California and through the joint practice?
Yeah, especially the joint practice. I mean, there weren't a lot of big plays to be had for those young quarterbacks who were under a lot of pressure with those first team reps against the Rams. But one of those big plays was this deep bomb down the left sideline from Spencer Rattler to Rasheed Shaheed. And, look, Rasheed Shaheed is one of the perennial outstanding deep threats in the NFL, but he has shown so much in terms of what he can do in the short and intermediate areas of the game so far here throughout camp. That Kellen Moore has kind of opened up that route tree a little bit for him, let him be a catch and run threat, let him be, kind of that short, 3-level threat, which is only going to make him better deep because he'd be more efficient with their usage of that. I think that is, I think we've seen a lot of growth from Rasheed Shaheed. And much like most of the team, the biggest question around Shaheed is he going to be able to stay healthy throughout the 2025 season? And you're asking that question for most teams, most players, right? Especially the valuable ones.